Hello, welcome to Kindergarten Bible Part 2. If you have not seen Part 1, I encourage you to watch that. It's not essential that you see the two in order, but it probably would help a lot. This latter part of the lesson is to just kind of put the finishing touches on some information that I gave you in Part 1 and to add a little bit more uh, that will be helpful to you in times when you're studying and reading other articles and so forth. Okay, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is what are called books of the Bible. Now, when I introduced the Bible in the first part of the lesson, I emphasized two big sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. I ignored some smaller divisions that if you looked at a table of contents, you would notice. And that's the names of these smaller sections. They're called books. Now, why are they called books? Because they were originally separate books. And the ancients kept these in separate structures. Often they would be scrolls like this, long sheets of paper rolled up on spindles of some sort so that you could unroll part of it, read that part, and then continue on and keep the whole thing together in the two rolls. So each book was a separate scroll. And these books had names. How they came by their names varied with the book. In some cases, the author. In some cases, the subject matter, whatever, would give rise to the name of the book. In the Old Testament, there are 39 books, and in the New Testament, 27 books. Eventually, these books were incorporated in volumes that incorporated the whole set of books. In the case of the Hebrew Bible, only the Old Testament books were found. The Christian Bible would have both the Old and New Testament. And so these books, as I said, had names. They, in some cases, had authors that are known. Others were by nameless authors. I will get into some of that at another time. What I want to do is move on from that and take a look at smaller divisions than books. And to illustrate that, if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to look up a particular part of the book of John. So if you look at that particular book, or any other book in the Bible, you will find that there are sections within the book, and these are called chapters. We're going to look at the third chapter. Most chapters in the Bible are not as long as chapters in most books that we read. A page or so, usually. That varies, of course, from place to place in the Bible. Now, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a particular place in the third chapter of John. And we can pinpoint that particular part of the chapter by looking at the verses. So within chapters, you find that there are smaller divisions called verses. Now, we'll get into the style by which these are presented in the Bible shortly, but you will find in some cases these totally separate, and in some cases parts of paragraphs. So we're going to look at the 16th verse of the third chapter. And that verse, John chapter 3, verse 16, reads, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." That is one of the most famous verses in the Bible. Now, these chapters and verses were set up from about 1200 to 1500. In those centuries, first of all, a Jewish scholar set up chapters and verses in Old Testament books, and then Christian scholars followed his lead and set up chapters and verses in New Testament books, and eventually that whole system was sort of set in stone. People didn't mess with it after a certain time. In some cases, that's a little regrettable. There's some places where you wished a chapter went a little farther, or maybe you think a chapter should have been cut off a little earlier, and verses the same way. But whatever the case, what it is what it is today. But the important thing is that it is static, it is fixed, and it has become a very useful tool, a sort of filing system, to find any particular passage or any particular even sentence in the Bible. So, just as I have done in this case, I can tell you where to find that particular important verse that begins, "For God so loved the world," in the book of John, the third chapter, the 16th verse. Now, let's look at one other passage. look at Exodus, the 20th chapter, starting with the 3rd verse. Now, Exodus is the second book in the Bible, and we find the 20th chapter of Exodus and begin with the 3rd verse, and there we find the 10 commandments. So I'll just read just some samples here. The very first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." That's in verse 3 of chapter 20. The next commandment is a little long, and I'm just going to skip over that, and we'll go to the 7th verse and find, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." Third commandment. Moving on down, we find in verse 13, "You shall not murder." 14, "You shall not commit adultery." 15, "You shall not steal," and so forth. 20 commandments, starting at verse 3 and going through verse 17. So again, we can easily communicate to another person where the 10 commandments are found. And so this whole chapter and verse system is very convenient. Now, I might mention that you find some different styles of the way material is presented in the Bible. In older Bibles, what are called King James Bibles, each verse is set off with an indentation and the number of the verse to begin, and that verse is obviously separated from all the other verses in that chapter. Excuse me. In recent years, editors have begun to put make paragraphs to sort of mimic the way we're used to reading material. And these paragraphs generally will consist of several verses. So the verses will not be separately indented, and you'll just find the verse numbers as little superscripts right by the beginning of each